Next, we have unexpressed quantifiers. So lots of sentences in English talk about relationships between classes without explicitly expressing a quantity for that class. And so when we have a statement like this where the quantity isn't explicitly expressed, we're going to want to introduce one of our three quantifiers, the one that makes the most sense given our world knowledge, given the speaker's intent, and things of that nature. So here's a sentence. A chameleon's tongue is as long as its body. So we look at this, there's no standard form quantifier here. We could say a chameleon. Well, maybe that's some because it's at least one chameleon. But this doesn't really seem to be talking about one chameleon or a couple of chameleons. It seems to be saying something about chameleons. So it's probably best that we use a universal affirmative here. And we go, all chameleons. What? Are copula consistent with the quantifier, and then we fold all the rest of it, add a noun phrase, into a predicate term. Creatures with tongues as long as their bodies. So some sentences, they just don't express a quantity. Other sentences, they express a quantity, but it's not the standard quantifier copula relationship, or it's not a standard quantity in our logic. So here's an example of that. Two men are trying to cross Antarctica. Okay, two isn't all, it's not no, and it's not at least one. But at least one would be true whenever two is true. And so some looks like our best quantifier here. So some men are men trying to cross Antarctica. We could use any noun phrase in that predicate term to pick out a class of things so long as it makes sense. So people trying to cross Antarctica, explorers trying to cross Antarctica, and so on. The next bit of advice here that gives us is what to do when we have a conditional statement. So as you recall, a conditional statement is actually a statement in our propositional logic. It's a statement that relates to the truth of two individual propositional statements. It relates them in terms of their truth values. Our categorical logic doesn't have any structures for talking about those relationships. However, as Hurley notes, we can look at our antecedent, describe what makes the antecedent true as a class that is a class of the things that make the antecedent true. We can look at our consequent, describe our consequent not as a proposition, but in terms of a class. That's all the ways you could make our consequent true. And then we can relate them using a categorical statement. So if we have, say, something like this, if you see a parrot outside, then it's feral. That's a categorical statement, or conditional statement. Our antecedent is if you see a parrot outside. Our consequent is it's feral. So we use our universal affirmative. We take our antecedent. We describe that as a class. In this case, I use parrots. We might want to use parrots that are outside as a more accurate description. Our copula consistent with the quantifier, and then our consequent class. Anything that's feral would be feral animals, a class of things that makes that statement true. So we get a standard form categorical statement that has about the same truth conditions as the conditional statement. Next, Hurley mentions exclusive propositions. So these are propositions where the relationship is phrased in terms of exclusion. So for example, only electric scooters are banned from campus. So we've got only here. That tells us that if you are something that is banned from campus, you've got to be an electric scooter. So all vehicles banned from campus are electric scooters. Now, Hurley then makes a point of telling us that only can be used to talk about exclusive propositions, but the only is a phrase that doesn't introduce exclusive propositions. So if we have a phrase like this, the only people to walk in the moon are astronauts, then what that is telling us is all people who walked on the moon are astronauts. So the difference between our top and our bottom here, only electric scooters becomes our predicate class. Our banned from campus, that becomes our subject class. In our second phrase with the only, we don't reverse our subject and predicates. Instead, we use our universal affirmative quantifier. We keep that same order. People who walked on the moon are astronauts. Now, the last bit of advice Hurley gives us is sometimes we have statements that are what he calls exceptive propositions. And so what do those things do? Well, those things state a general rule and an exception in terms of relationships between classes. And so when we translate an exceptive proposition, we'll use a standard form categorical statement to express the rule and a standard form categorical statement to express the exception. So Stan Lee appears in all MC movies except Guardians of the Galaxy. So we've got a rule and we've got an exception. So for our exception, no Guardians of the Galaxy movies are movies in which Stan Lee appears. Our rule, all non-Guardians of the Galaxy movies are movies in which Stan Lee appears. Now we have a standard form categorical statement for our rule and one for our exception.